debt.
Economic history reveals a disturbing pattern that repeats itself across centuries.
Declining empires facing devastating monetary crises frequently resort to war as a desperate last measure.
This is not coincidence. It is a documented cycle stretching from ancient Rome to contemporary conflicts. When an empire's currency begins to collapse, when inflation erodes purchasing power and debt becomes unsustainable, leaders face an impossible choice: accept inevitable decline
Leaders face
or risk
an impossible
everything in a
choice:
conflict
accept
that might
inevitable
postpone the
decline
collapse.
or risk everything
War,
in a
paradoxically,
conflict that might
becomes both a
postpone the
distraction
collapse.
and a temporary
War,
solution to
paradoxically,
terminal
becomes
economic
both a
crises.
distraction and
This
a
phenomenon
temporary
is not
solution to
accidental.
terminal economic
It is structural,
crises.
predictable,
This phenomenon
and
is
deeply
not
revealing about the
accidental.
nature of imperial
It
power
is
and
structural,
monetary
predictable,
fragility.
and
To
deeply
understand this
revealing
pattern,
about the
we
nature
must
of
first
imperial
grasp
power
what
and
constitutes
monetary
the death of an
fragility.
imperial currency.
To understand
This
this
is
pattern,
not simply
we must
high
first
inflation or
grasp what
temporary recession.
constitutes the death of an
Monetary
imperial
death
currency.
represents the complete
This is not
collapse of
simply high
confidence in an
inflation
empire's
or
medium of
temporary
exchange.
recession. Monetary
Historically,
death
this
represents
process
the
follows
complete collapse
recognizable
of
stages.
confidence in an
First,
empire's
the
medium of
empire
exchange.
expands beyond its fiscal
Historically,
capacity.
this process
Territorial
follows
conquests,
recognizable
initially
stages.
profitable,
First,
transform
the
into
empire
costly
expands
administrative
beyond
and
its fiscal
military
capacity.
burdens.
Territorial
The empire must
conquests,
maintain
initially
standing armies
profitable,
on distant
transform
frontiers,
into costly
build
administrative
infrastructure in
and
remote
military
provinces,
burdens.
and suppress revolts
The
in conquered
empire must
territories.
maintain standing
Costs
armies
explode
on
while
distant
revenues
frontiers,
stagnate.
build
In the
infrastructure in
second
remote
stage,
provinces,
the empire
and
begins
suppress
manipulating
revolts in
its own
conquered
currency to
territories.
finance
Costs
unsustainable
explode
commitments.
while revenues
Rome debased
stagnate.
the denarius
In the second
systematically over
stage, the
centuries,
empire begins
reducing silver
manipulating its
content from
own currency to
95%
finance
to less than
unsustainable
5% in
commitments.
200 years.
Rome debased the
Imperial Spain
denarius
flooded Europe
systematically
with
over
American silver,
centuries,
causing
reducing
massive
silver
inflation
content
that
from
destroyed its own
95%
economy in
to
the
less than
17th century.
5% in 200 years.
Pre-revolutionary France printed
Imperial Spain
assignats without
flooded
backing,
Europe with
creating
American silver,
catastrophic
causing massive
hyperinflation.
inflation
The
that
pattern
destroyed
is
its own
invariable.
economy in the 17th
Desperate
century.
governments monetize their debts,
Pre-revolutionary
expand
France
the money
printed
supply,
assignats
and
without
destroy the
backing,
value of the
creating
currency their citizens
catastrophic
use.
hyperinflation.
The third stage
The
is the
pattern
loss of
is
confidence.
invariable.
When merchants,
Desperate
bankers,
governments
and ordinary
monetize their
citizens
debts,
perceive that the
expand the
currency
money
is being
supply, and
systematically
destroy the
devalued,
value of
they
the
begin
currency
seeking
their
alternatives.
citizens use.
In the ancient
The
world,
third
this
stage
meant
is the
hoarding
loss
physical
of
gold and
confidence.
silver.
When
In the modern
merchants,
period, it
bankers,
means
and
flight to
ordinary
foreign
citizens
currencies,
perceive
real
that the
assets,
currency is
or,
being
more recently,
systematically devalued,
cryptocurrencies.
they begin
This loss
seeking
of confidence
alternatives.
accelerates
In
exponentially.
the ancient
Once
world, this
initiated,
meant
it becomes
hoarding physical
virtually
gold and
impossible to
silver.
reverse without
In the modern
draconian
period,
measures
it
that
means
typically
flight to
arrive
foreign
too late.
currencies,
It
real
is
assets,
precisely at
or more
this critical
recently,
moment, when currency
cryptocurrencies.
enters terminal
This loss of
collapse,
confidence
that empires
accelerates
historically resort
exponentially.
to war.
Once
The
initiated,
reasons are
it becomes
multiple and
virtually
interconnected.
impossible to reverse
First,
without
war
draconian
offers an
measures that
alternative
typically
narrative for
arrive
economic
too
suffering.
late. It
Populations
is
facing
precisely
galloping
at this
inflation,
critical moment
massive
when
unemployment, and
currency enters
impoverishment
terminal
can be
collapse
convinced
that
that their
empires
problems result
historically
not from
resort to
fiscal
war.
mismanagement,
The
but
reasons
from
are
external
multiple and
threats. The
interconnected.
foreign enemy becomes the
First,
perfect
war offers
scapegoat
an
for domestic
alternative
crises.
narrative for economic
Governments in
suffering.
crisis can mobilize nationalist
Populations
sentiments,
facing galloping
transform
inflation,
critics into
massive
traitors, and
unemployment,
consolidate
and
power through
impoverishment can
emergency
be
measures that
convinced
would be
that their
unthinkable
problems
in
result
peacetime.
not from fiscal
Second,
mismanagement,
war
but
permits
from
extraordinary
external
economic
threats.
measures that would
The
be
foreign
politically
enemy becomes
impossible
the
under normal
perfect scapegoat
circumstances.
for domestic
Price
crises.
controls, rationing,
Governments in
confiscation of
crisis
private
can
resources,
mobilize
massive
nationalist
debt
sentiments,
monetization, and
transform
suspension of
critics into
economic freedoms
traitors,
become
and
acceptable
consolidate
under
power
the
through
justification
emergency
of
measures
national
that would be
emergency.
unthinkable
What
in
would be
peacetime.
considered economic tyranny in
Second, war
peacetime
permits
transforms into
extraordinary
necessary
economic measures that
patriotism
would be
during
politically
conflicts.
impossible
This
under
cover
normal
allows governments
circumstances.
to implement
Price
even more
controls,
destructive
rationing,
policies while suppressing
confiscation
dissent.
of private resources,
Third, and perhaps most
massive debt
importantly,
monetization,
war offers the
and
possibility of
suspension of
plunder and
economic
conquest of
freedoms
resources
become
that can
acceptable under
temporarily
the
stabilize a
justification
dying
of
currency.
national emergency.
Hitler invaded
What
neighboring
would be
countries
considered
and
economic
systematically
tyranny
looted their
in
central
peacetime
banks,
transforms into
confiscating gold
necessary
reserves that
patriotism
sustained the
during
Reichsmark
conflicts.
temporarily.
This cover allows
Napoleon
governments to
financed his
implement
campaigns
even
through
more destructive
indemnities imposed
policies
on conquered
while
nations.
suppressing dissent.
European colonial
Third,
empires
and perhaps
extracted
most
resources from
importantly,
conquered
war
territories
offers the
to sustain
possibility of
declining
plunder and
metropolitan
conquest
economies.
of resources
War,
that can
in this
temporarily
perspective, becomes
stabilize
a
a dying
mechanism of
currency.
forced wealth transfer
Hitler
from other
invaded
peoples to the
neighboring
collapsing
countries and
empire.
systematically
Fourth,
looted their
war
central
production
banks,
offers a
confiscating
distorted
gold
Keynesian
reserves
solution
that
to
sustained
massive
the
unemployment
Reichsmark
and economic
temporarily.
stagnation.
Napoleon
When the
financed his
civilian economy
campaigns through
collapses,
indemnities
military
imposed on
mobilization
conquered
employs
nations.
millions.
European
Factories convert to
colonial
armaments
empires
production, and
extracted
government
resources
becomes
from
the employer
conquered
of last
territories
resort.
to sustain
This
declining
war economy
metropolitan
creates an illusion
economies.
of prosperity, even while destroying real capital and directing resources toward unproductive activities. Economic statistics improve superficially while the real productive base deteriorates. Fifth, war centralizes political power in unprecedented ways. Democracies become temporary autocracies. Parliaments grant extraordinary powers to the executive. Dissent is criminalized as treason. Press is censored as national security necessity. For political elites facing growing popular discontent due to monetary crisis, this centralization of power can seem attractive, even if they do not consciously admit this motivation. History documents this pattern repeatedly. Rome, facing uncontrolled inflation in the 3rd century, launched into constant conflicts on the frontiers. The 30 Years' War coincided with the massive monetary crisis caused by Spanish silver inflation. Revolutionary France, with the assignat in hyperinflationary collapse, embarked on the Napoleonic Wars. Weimar Germany, after the hyperinflation of 1923, eventually followed Hitler into World War II. The pattern repeats because the structural pressures are identical.
The mechanics of how currency collapse drives empires toward war become clearer when we examine the fiscal dynamics at play. An empire's currency serves multiple critical functions simultaneously. It operates as the medium of exchange for domestic commerce, the unit of account for taxation and government spending, the store of value for citizen savings, and, crucially, the instrument through which the empire projects power internationally. When this currency begins to fail, all these functions deteriorate simultaneously, creating a cascading crisis that threatens the empire's very existence. The government finds itself trapped in a vicious cycle where declining currency value reduces tax revenues in real terms, forces increased money printing to cover deficits, which further accelerates currency depreciation, creating a death spiral that becomes nearly impossible to escape through conventional policy measures. Consider the specific case of the Roman Empire during the 3rd century crisis. By the year 250, the denarius had been debased so severely that it contained barely 5% silver compared to nearly pure silver 2 centuries earlier. This debasement was not arbitrary vandalism, but a calculated response to unsustainable imperial commitments. Rome maintained allegiance across 3 continents, built roads and aqueducts throughout the empire, provided grain subsidies to urban populations, and funded an elaborate imperial bureaucracy. As conquests ended and territorial expansion ceased, the empire lost its primary source of new wealth, while maintaining all the costs of administration and defense. The currency debasement was the only mechanism available to bridge the gap between revenues and expenditures. The consequences were devastating and instructive. Soldiers, paid in increasingly worthless denarii, began demanding payment in goods rather than currency. Merchants refused to accept official coinage, reverting to barter or demanding payment in precious metals by weight rather than by face value. Tax collection became nearly impossible as citizens hoarded anything of real value and paid taxes in the debased currency that bought almost nothing. The social contract binding the empire together began to dissolve. Citizens who had accepted Roman rule in exchange for security, infrastructure, and economic opportunity now found themselves impoverished by the very government supposed to protect them. Rome's response to this crisis followed the pattern we observe across history. Unable to reform the fundamental fiscal imbalance and politically incapable of accepting territorial contraction, the empire launched into a series of aggressive military campaigns. These wars served multiple purposes simultaneously. They provided opportunities to extract wealth from conquered peoples through immediate plunder and ongoing tribute. They justified the economic hardship citizens were experiencing by creating external threats that required sacrifice. They employed restless military forces that might otherwise turn against the government. And they offered the tantalizing possibility of discovering new sources of wealth that could solve the monetary crisis. The pattern intensified during the later Roman Empire. Emperor Aurelian, facing complete currency collapse in the 270s, launched massive military campaigns while simultaneously attempting currency reform. Emperor Diocletian, confronting similar crises decades later, imposed empire-wide price controls backed by death penalties while simultaneously expanding military operations. These policies failed to address the fundamental problem of fiscal imbalance, but successfully postponed the final collapse through decades of continuous warfare. The empire did not solve its currency crisis. It merely extended its existence through military aggression funded by the very monetary debasement that was destroying it. Fast forward to early modern Europe, and we observe the same pattern with different actors. Spain emerged from the 15th century as Europe's dominant power, fueled by enormous quantities of silver extracted from American colonies. The Spanish real became Europe's reserve currency, and Spanish military power seemed invincible. Yet, by the late 16th century, Spain faced serial bankruptcy, despite controlling history's largest precious metal flows. The problem was structural. Spain used American silver to finance continuous European wars, maintaining armies in the Netherlands, fighting Ottoman expansion in the Mediterranean, and intervening in France's religious conflicts. Military expenditures consistently exceeded even the enormous revenues from colonial exploitation. Spain's response to recurring monetary crises followed our established pattern. Rather than contracting militarily and living within its means, Spain escalated its military commitments. The government repeatedly debased copper coinage, issued short-term debt at unsustainable rates, and confiscated private shipments of silver arriving from America. Each bankruptcy led not to military retrenchment, but to renewed military aggression, as if conquest could solve the fundamental imbalance between imperial ambitions and fiscal reality. The wars in Flanders, the attempted invasion of England, the intervention in the 30 Years' War, all occurred during periods of acute Spanish monetary crisis and represented desperate attempts to use military force to resolve fiscal impossibilities. The French experience offers perhaps the most dramatic illustration of this pattern. By 1789, the French monarchy faced complete fiscal collapse. Years of expensive wars, particularly French support for American independence, had created insurmountable debts. The government's borrowing costs exceeded its ability to service debt through taxation. Various financial schemes, including John Law's earlier Mississippi bubble and subsequent monetary experiments, had destroyed public confidence in French financial instruments. The assignat, initially issued as interest-bearing bonds backed by confiscated church lands, rapidly transformed into fiat currency printed in unlimited quantities. The hyperinflation that followed was catastrophic. By 1796, the assignat had lost 99% of its value. A currency that began as a seemingly reasonable expedient to address fiscal crisis became the vehicle for destroying France's entire monetary system. Citizens who had supported the revolution found their life savings obliterated. Merchants could not conduct business with currency that lost value between morning and evening. The social fabric began to tear as economic calculation became impossible and survival required constant speculation rather than productive work. France's response was predictable given historical precedent. The Revolutionary and Napoleonic Wars, lasting from 1792 to 1815, represented the most sustained period of European warfare in modern history. These wars were not simply ideological conflicts about revolutionary principles. They were fundamentally driven by France's need to extract resources from conquered territories to sustain an economy whose currency had collapsed. Napoleon systematically looted the central banks of conquered nations. He imposed indemnities that transferred enormous wealth from defeated enemies to France. He requisitioned supplies from occupied territories, forcing other nations to feed and supply French
Stretching within its means,
War became
Spain
France's economic
escalated
model
its
because the
military
domestic economy,
commitments.
destroyed by
The
monetary
government
collapse, could not
repeatedly
sustain the
debased
state.
copper
The
coinage,
German experience
issued
following World War
short-term
I
debt at
provides the 20th
unsustainable
century's
rates,
clearest
and
example of this pattern.
confiscated private
The Weimar
shipments of
Republic faced
silver
impossible
arriving from
reparation demands,
America.
while
Each
simultaneously dealing with the
bankruptcy
economic
led not to
dislocation of
military
military defeat.
retrenchment, but
Unable
to
to meet
renewed
obligations
military
through taxation
aggression,
and
as
unable
if
to borrow
conquest
given
could
the
solve
destroyed
the
state of German
fundamental
credit, the
imbalance
government
between
resorted to printing
imperial
money on an
ambitions and
unprecedented
fiscal
scale.
reality.
The resulting hyperinflation
The
of
wars in
1923
Flanders,
remains
the
history's most
attempted
studied monetary
invasion of
collapse.
England,
At its
the
peak, prices
intervention in
doubled
the
every
30
few days.
Years' War
Workers demanded
occurred
payment
during
twice daily
periods
so
of
they could
acute
spend money before
Spanish
it became
monetary
worthless.
crises,
Life savings,
and
bonds,
represented
pensions, all
desperate
forms of
attempts
monetary
to
wealth
use
were
military
obliterated.
force
The
to
middle
resolve
class
fiscal
backbone of German society
impossibilities.
was economically
The French
annihilated.
experience
This
offers
monetary
perhaps the
catastrophe
most
created the
dramatic
political conditions for
illustration of
Hitler's
this
rise.
pattern.
The Nazi
By
economic program, often
1789,
misunderstood
the
as some
French
form of
monarchy
innovative
faced
policy,
complete
was
fiscal
fundamentally a
collapse.
preparation for war and
Years of
conquest.
expensive wars,
Germany in the
particularly
1930s
French
faced the
support
same
for
impossible
American
situation as
independence,
Rome in the
had
3rd century
created
or France in the
insurmountable
1790s.
debts.
A gap
The
between state
government's borrowing
commitments and available
costs
resources
exceeded
that
its
could not be
ability
bridged
to
through normal
service
economic
debt
means.
through taxation.
Hitler's solution was identical
Various
to his historical
financial
predecessors.
schemes,
Use
including
military
John
conquest
Law's
to
earlier
extract
Mississippi
resources from
bubble
other
and
nations to
subsequent
sustain an
monetary
unsustainable domestic system.
experiments,
The
had
invasion of
destroyed
Austria
public
allowed
confidence
confiscation of
in
Austrian
French
gold reserves.
financial
The
instruments.
conquest of
The
Czechoslovakia provided
assignat,
immediate wealth
initially
and industrial
issued as
capacity.
interest-bearing
Each
bonds,
subsequent invasion
backed
was
by
partially motivated
confiscated
by the need
church
to loot
lands,
central banks and
rapidly
extract resources
transformed
to
into
sustain the
fiat
German war
currency
machine and
printed in
postpone domestic
unlimited
economic
quantities.
collapse.
The
The pattern
hyperinflation
intensified
that
during the later
followed was
Roman Empire.
catastrophic.
Emperor
By
Aurelian, facing complete
1796,
currency
the
collapse in the
assignat had
270s,
lost
launched massive military
99% of
campaigns
its value.
while simultaneously
A
attempting
currency
currency
that
reform.
began as a
Emperor
seemingly
Diocletian,
reasonable
confronting similar
expedient
crises
to
decades
address
later,
fiscal
imposed
crisis,
empire-wide price
became the
controls
vehicle
backed by
for
death penalties
destroying
while
France's
simultaneously
entire
expanding military
monetary
operations.
system.
These policies
Citizens who
failed to
had
address the
supported the
fundamental problem of
revolution
fiscal imbalance,
found their
but
life
successfully
savings
postponed the final
obliterated.
collapse through decades of
Merchants
continuous
could not
warfare.
conduct business
The
with
empire did not
currency
solve its
that
currency
lost
crisis.
value
It
between
merely
morning
extended
and
its existence
evening.
through
The
military
social
aggression
fabric
funded by the
began to
very
tear
monetary
as
debasement that was
economic
destroying it.
calculation became
Fast forward to
impossible,
early modern
and
Europe, and
survival
we observe the same
required
pattern with
constant
different actors.
speculation
Spain
rather than
emerged from the
productive
15th
work.
century as Europe's dominant
France's
power,
response
fueled by
was
the
predictable
connection
given
between currency
historical
collapse and
precedent.
military aggression
The
extends
Revolutionary
beyond
and
mere historical
Napoleonic
curiosity
Wars,
into the realm of
lasting from
structural inevitability.
1792
When
to
we examine the
1815,
incentive structures facing
represented
political
the
leaders
most
during monetary
sustained
crises,
period of
the logic of
European
war
warfare
becomes
in
grimly
modern
rational.
history.
Leaders
These
confronting
wars were
currency
not
death
simply
face a
ideological
calculation where all
conflicts
peaceful
about
alternatives
revolutionary
lead to certain
principles.
political
They
destruction,
were fundamentally
while war
driven
offers
by
at least the
France.
possibility of
S
survival.
need to extract
This is not to
resources from
excuse or
conquered
justify these
territories
decisions,
to
but to
sustain an
understand
economy
why the
whose
pattern repeats
currency
with
had
such
collapsed.
regularity across vastly
Napoleon
different cultures,
systematically
time
looted
periods,
the
and
central
political
banks
systems.
of conquered
The
nations.
structural pressures
He
overwhelm
imposed
individual moral
indemnities that
considerations,
transferred
creating a
enormous
pathway
wealth
toward
from
conflict
defeated
that becomes
enemies to
increasingly
France.
difficult to avoid as
He
the monetary
requisitioned
crisis
supplies
deepens.
from
The
occupied
political economy
territories,
of currency
forcing
collapse
other
creates
nations to
specific
feed and
dynamics that
supply
make war
French
attractive
armies.
to failing regimes.
War became
First among
France's
these is the
economic
problem of
model
democratic
because the
accountability
domestic
during economic
economy,
catastrophe.
destroyed by
When
monetary
citizens experience
collapse,
rapidly
could not
declining
sustain
living
the
standards due to
state.
inflation or
The
currency
German
collapse,
experience
they
following
demand
World War
explanations
I
and solutions
provides
from
the
their
20th
leaders.
century's
In democratic
clearest
or
example of this
quasi-democratic
pattern.
systems, this
The
pressure
Weimar
manifests
Republic
through
faced
elections that threaten
impossible
to remove
reparation
incumbents from
demands,
power.
while
In authoritarian
simultaneously
systems, it
dealing with
creates
the
risks of
economic
coup, revolution,
dislocation
or
of
popular
military
uprising.
defeat.
Leaders facing these
Unable to
pressures
meet
have essentially
obligations
three
through
options:
taxation
accept
and unable
responsibility
to
and
borrow,
implement
given the
painful
destroyed
reforms that will
state of
likely
German
destroy them
credit,
politically,
the government
find
resorted
scapegoats
to
to blame for
printing
the
money
crisis,
on an
or
unprecedented
external
scale.
distractions
The
that
resulting
redirect public anger
hyperinflation of
outward rather than toward the
1923
government.
remains
History
history's
demonstrates that
most
leaders
studied
almost
monetary
universally
collapse.
choose the third
At
option
its
when
peak,
available.
prices
Creating an
doubled every
external
few
enemy
days.
serves multiple purposes
Workers demanded
simultaneously.
payment
It
twice
provides
daily,
a
so they
comprehensible
could spend
explanation for
money
economic
before it
suffering
became
that does not
worthless.
implicate the government's
Life
own
savings,
policies.
bonds,
Rather than admitting that
pensions,
monetary
all forms
debasement,
of monetary
excessive spending,
wealth were
or fiscal
obliterated.
mismanagement caused the
The
crisis,
middle-class
leaders can claim
backbone
that
of
foreign
German
threats,
society
saboteurs,
was
or
economically
international conspiracies are
annihilated.
responsible. This
This
narrative
monetary
transformation is
catastrophe
psychologically
created the
powerful
political
because it
conditions
converts
for
citizens
Hitler's
from victims
rise.
of their own government's
The Nazi
incompetence
economic
into
program,
heroic defenders
often
of the nation
misunderstood
against
as some
external
form
aggression.
of innovative
The emotional
policy,
valence
was
shifts
fundamentally
entirely,
a
transforming
preparation
anger
for
at
war
leaders
and
into
conquest.
anger at foreigners.
Germany
The
in the
mechanics of this
1930s
transformation are
faced
well
the same
documented in
impossible
psychological and
situation
political
as
science
Rome in the
research.
3rd century,
Humans are predisposed
or
to
France in the
in-group versus
1790s.
out-group thinking,
A gap
particularly under
between
conditions
state
of stress
commitments
and
and
uncertainty.
available
When
resources
economic
that
security
could not be
disappears
bridged
and the
through
future
normal
becomes frightening,
economic means.
people become more receptive to
Hitler's
narratives that
solution
identify
was
clear enemies
identical
and
to his
offer decisive
historical
action.
predecessor
War
Tu's
provides
military
exactly this
conquest
psychological
to
comfort.
extract
The
resources
complexity
from
and
other
ambiguity
nations
of
to
economic
sustain
crisis,
an
where causes are
unsustainable
diffuse,
domestic
responsibility
system.
is shared, and
The
solutions
invasion of
require
Austria
painful
allowed
trade-offs,
confiscation
transforms
of
into the
Austrian
clarity
gold
and simplicity
reserves.
of military
The
conflict,
conquest of
where friends and
Czechoslovakia
enemies are clearly
provided
identified
immediate
and
wealth
victory
and
seems achievable
industrial
through sufficient
capacity.
will and
Each
sacrifice.
subsequent
Beyond
invasion was
psychological
partially
manipulation, war
motivated
offers
by the need
concrete
to
economic
loot central
mechanisms that can
banks and
temporarily
extract
stabilize a failing
resources to
currency
sustain
or
the
at least
German war
postpone
machine
its
and
complete collapse.
postpone domestic
The most
economic
direct mechanism is the
collapse.
confiscation of foreign wealth. Throughout history, conquering armies have systematically looted the treasuries, central banks, and private wealth of defeated nations. This transfer of real assets, gold, silver, industrial equipment, art, land, to the conquering empire provides an immediate injection of value that can back a failing currency or finance government operations without additional money printing. The Nazis perfected this system, creating detailed administrative procedures for identifying, cataloging, and transferring wealth
This is
from
not to
conquered
excuse
territories
or
back to
justify these
Germany.
decisions,
Each
but to
invasion was
understand
followed
why
by
the pattern
systematic
repeats with
economic
such
extraction
regularity
that
across
temporarily
vastly different
sustained the German
cultures,
war
time
economy.
periods, and
War
political
also
systems.
enables comprehensive economic controls that would be impossible to implement in peacetime without triggering immediate political backlash. Price controls, rationing systems, forced labor, confiscation of private property, prohibition of gold ownership, capital controls preventing money from leaving the country, and countless other intrusions into economic freedom become not only acceptable but patriotic during wartime. Citizens who would riot against such measures in peacetime accept them as necessary sacrifices for national survival during conflict. This acceptance allows governments to suppress the visible symptoms of currency collapse, hyperinflation, shortages, economic chaos, even while the underlying monetary problems continue to worsen. The war economy creates an artificial stability that masks the terminal nature of the currency crisis. The mobilization of the economy for war production provides another mechanism for postponing the visible consequences of monetary collapse. When a currency dies, unemployment typically explodes as economic calculation becomes impossible and businesses cannot plan or operate normally. War mobilization solves this problem through massive government employment. Millions enter military service, removing them from the unemployment rolls. Millions more find employment in war industries, producing weapons, equipment, and supplies for the military. The government becomes the employer of last resort, paying workers in the failing currency, but providing essential goods through rationing systems. The statistics show full employment and industrial production, creating an illusion of economic health even as the real economy, measured in terms of goods and services that improve human welfare, collapses. This war economy creates powerful constituencies that benefit from the conflict and resist its conclusion.
Arms manufacturers, military contractors, and the vast bureaucracies managing the war effort all prosper during the conflict. These groups develop vested interests in the war's continuation, regardless of its strategic wisdom or ultimate cost. This dynamic helps explain why wars initiated during currency crises often continue long past any rational strategic purpose. The war becomes economically embedded in the society, and peace threatens to expose the underlying monetary catastrophe that the war was masking. Leaders fear that ending the conflict will immediately trigger the economic collapse they have been postponing, creating perverse incentives to continue fighting even when defeat becomes inevitable. The international dynamics of currency collapse also contribute to war's likelihood. A dying imperial currency typically served as a reserve currency or at least a widely accepted medium for international trade. As this currency fails, it disrupts the entire international economic order built around it. Trading partners face losses on their currency reserves. International debts become unpayable or payable only in worthless paper. The entire structure of international commerce, which depends on stable money and enforceable contracts, begins to break down. This breakdown creates both opportunities and threats for the failing empire. Opportunities emerge to use military force to compel acceptance of the dying currency or to avoid payment of international debts. Threats emerge from other powers attempting to fill the power vacuum or to protect themselves from the economic chaos radiating from the failing empire. Britain's experience during the mid-20th century illustrates these international dynamics. The pound sterling, which had served as the world's primary reserve currency for over a century, entered terminal decline following World War II. Britain emerged from the war victorious, but economically devastated, deeply indebted, and unable to maintain the currency's value. The pound faced repeated crises throughout the 1940s, 50s, and 60s as Britain struggled to maintain its international role with a currency no longer supported by underlying economic reality. Britain's response included military interventions aimed at preserving empire and access to resources. The Suez Crisis of 1956, though ultimately a failure, represented an attempt to use military force to maintain Britain's position as the pound sterling collapsed. Only when the pound was finally devalued and Britain accepted its diminished international role did these military interventions cease. The United States dollar's role as global reserve currency since 1945 creates contemporary relevance for this historical pattern. The dollar's position depends not primarily on America's economic strength, but on international confidence and the absence of viable alternatives. Should this confidence erode, the dollar could face a crisis similar to historical currency collapses, but with global implications, given the currency's universal role. The United States military maintains over 700 bases in approximately 80 countries, projects power globally, and spends more on defense than the next 10 countries combined. This military presence, often justified through security arguments, also serves the function of maintaining the international order that supports dollar dominance. Whether intentionally or not, American military power underwrites the currency's international role. Understanding this connection between monetary crisis and military aggression requires acknowledging uncomfortable realities about the nature of political power and economic systems. Leaders facing currency collapse are not simply evil or irrational when they choose war. They are responding rationally to incentive structures that make peace catastrophic and war at least potentially survivable from their perspective. The human costs of this calculation,
the contemporary implications of this historical pattern demand serious examination, particularly as we observe familiar warning signs in the current global monetary system. The post-Bretton Woods era, which began when President Nixon severed the dollar's link to gold in 1971, represents an unprecedented experiment in purely fiat currency on a global scale. For the first time in history, the world's reserve currency maintains no backing whatsoever beyond the faith and credit of its issuing government. This arrangement has persisted for over 5 decades, far longer than most economists predicted. But the structural vulnerabilities inherent inherent in such a system remain unchanged from those that destroyed previous monetary regimes. The United States faces mounting federal debt that now exceeds $34 trillion, persistent fiscal deficits that show no signs of correction, and growing questions internationally about the dollar's long-term viability as a reserve currency. The mechanisms that allowed previous empires' currencies to collapse are fully operational today. The United States government finances expenditures far exceeding tax revenues through continuous debt issuance, functionally identical to the currency debasement practiced by Rome or the money printing that destroyed the Weimar Republic. The Federal Reserve, through quantitative easing and other monetary interventions, has expanded the money supply by trillions of dollars since the 2008 financial crisis. While modern central banking provides more sophisticated tools than ancient coin debasement, the fundamental operation remains identical: expanding the monetary supply to finance government operations beyond what taxation alone would permit. The consequences, though delayed by the dollar's reserve currency status, cannot be indefinitely postponed. International developments suggest this arrangement's vulnerability is increasing. China, Russia, and other nations have begun conducting bilateral trade in currencies other than dollars, directly challenging the greenback's monopoly in international commerce. Central banks worldwide have increased gold purchases to record levels, suggesting declining confidence in dollar-denominated reserves. The BRICS nations, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, have discussed creating alternative payment systems and potentially a new reserve currency to reduce dollar dependence. While none of these developments individually threatens dollar hegemony, collectively they represent the early stages of the confidence erosion that precedes currency collapse in historical examples. The process may take years or decades, but the direction is unmistakable. American military policy during this period of mounting fiscal stress follows the historical pattern with disturbing precision. The United States has been continuously at war for over 2 decades, with military operations in Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, Libya, Yemen, and numerous other locations. Defense spending has remained at levels historically associated with major wars, even during periods nominally characterized as peacetime. The military-industrial complex that President Eisenhower warned against has become fully embedded in the American economy, with weapons manufacturing and defense contracting representing major industries in virtually every state. Proposals to reduce military spending face fierce opposition, not only from defense hawks, but from the vast economic constituencies that depend on continued military expenditure. The justifications for this military posture have shifted over time, from containing Soviet communism to fighting terrorism to countering Chinese expansion, but the underlying pattern remains constant. Each new threat justifies maintaining or expanding military capabilities. Meanwhile, the fiscal crisis deepens. The Congressional Budget Office projects that interest payments on the federal debt will exceed defense spending within years, consuming an ever larger share of government revenue and crowding out other priorities. This trajectory is unsustainable, yet political consensus for addressing it does not exist. Both major political parties support continued deficit spending, disagreeing only about which programs to expand or which taxes to cut. The bipartisan consensus that created the fiscal crisis remains intact. Historical precedent suggests that this combination, mounting currency stress combined with extensive military commitments, creates conditions for escalating rather than reducing military conflict. Leaders facing the political impossibility of fiscal reform while confronting currency crisis have consistently chosen military escalation throughout history. The current geopolitical environment provides numerous potential flashpoints where such escalation might occur. Taiwan represents perhaps the most dangerous, where American commitments to defend the island against Chinese reunification efforts could trigger direct conflict between nuclear powers. Ukraine has already demonstrated how quickly regional conflicts can escalate and draw in major powers. The Middle East remains perpetually unstable, with American military presence and commitments creating constant intervention risks.
and still
Any of
face
these
the choice
situations
between
could serve
accepting
as the
decline
catalyst for
peacefully
larger
or
conflicts,
attempting
driven
to
partly by
postpone
the
it
same
through military
dynamics that
force.
drove
The
Rome,
contemporary
Spain, France,
implications
and
of
Germany
this
into
historical
wars during
pattern
their currency
demand
crises.
serious
The
examination,
nuclear dimension adds
particularly as we
unprecedented
observe
danger to this
familiar
historical
warning
pattern.
signs in the
Previous
current
empires
global
facing
monetary
currency death
system.
could wage
The
conventional wars,
post-Bretton
whose
Woods
destruction,
era,
while terrible,
which
remained
began when
limited in
President
absolute
Nixon
terms.
severed the
Modern
dollar's
nuclear
link to
arsenals
gold in
create the possibility of human
1971,
extinction. Yet the
represents
political
an
and economic
unprecedented
forces driving
experiment
empires
in
toward war
purely
during
fiat
currency crises
currency on a
remain
global
operational.
scale.
The hope that
For the
nuclear
first
deterrence
time
makes
in
major power
history,
war impossible
the world's
assumes
reserve
rational
currency
calculation
maintains
prevails
no
over the structural
backing
pressures we have
whatsoever
examined.
beyond the
History
faith and
suggests
credit
this
of its
assumption may be
issuing
dangerously
government.
optimistic.
This
Leaders
arrangement
facing
has
domestic
persisted
collapse
for
due to
over
currency
5
crisis have
decades,
consistently
far
chosen
longer
reckless
than most
military gambles
economists
throughout history.
predicted.
The presence
But the
of nuclear
structural
weapons may deter
vulnerabilities
direct
inherent in
confrontation
such
during
a
stable
system
periods,
remain
but might not prevent
unchanged from
escalation
those
once
that
conflict
destroyed
begins, particularly
previous
if leaders
monetary
believe they
regimes.
face domestic catastrophe
The United
regardless.
States
Breaking
faces
this pattern
mounting
requires
federal
confronting
debt that now
uncomfortable truths
exceeds
about the current
$34
monetary and
trillion.
fiscal trajectory. The
Persistent
United States
fiscal
cannot
deficits
indefinitely
that show
finance
no
unlimited
signs
government
of
spending
correction,
through money
and growing
creation
questions
without eventually facing
internationally
the same
about the
currency
dollar's
collapse that
long-term
destroyed every
viability
previous
as a
attempt at
reserve
perpetual
currency.
deficit finance.
The
The
mechanisms
dollar's
that
reserve
allowed
currency status
previous
provides
empires'
temporary
currencies
immunity,
to collapse
but this
are
immunity
fully
depends
operational
entirely on
today.
international
The
confidence
United
that can
States
disappear
government
with shocking
finances
speed once eroded.
expenditures far
Responsible
exceeding
policy
tax
would involve
revenues
bringing government
through
spending in line
continuous
with
debt
revenues,
issuance,
reducing the debt burden, and
functionally
unwinding the monetary
identical to the
expansion of recent
currency
decades.
debasement
Such
practiced by
policies
Rome,
would be
or
economically
the money
painful in the short
printing
term,
that
but
destroyed
would address
the
the
Weimar
structural imbalances
Republic.
that otherwise make
The
collapse
Federal
inevitable.
Reserve,
The
through
political obstacles
quantitative
to such
easing
reform
and
appear
other
insurmountable.
monetary
No
interventions,
major political
has
figure campaigns on the
expanded the money
necessary
supply
austerity
by
measures.
trillions
Voters,
of dollars
accustomed to government
since the
services and benefits
2008
funded by deficit
financial
spending,
crisis,
resist any reduction.
while modern
Special
central
interests that
banking
benefit from
provides
current
more
arrangements,
sophisticated
defense contractors,
tools
entitlement
than ancient
recipients,
coin
government
debasement.
employees
The
secure powerful
fundamental
coalitions
operation
against reform.
remains identical.
The media and policy
Expanding the
establishment
monetary
largely
supply
deny
to
that serious
finance
fiscal
government
crisis
operations
exists, pointing to
beyond
continued
what
ability to
taxation
issue debt at
alone
manageable
would
interest
permit.
rates as
The
evidence that concerns
consequences,
about
though
sustainability
delayed
are
by the
overblown.
dollar's reserve
This
currency
denial
status,
persists despite
cannot
historical
be
evidence
indefinitely
that currency
postponed.
crises, when they finally arrive,
International
do so
developments
suddenly after
suggest
long
this
periods of apparent
arrangement's
stability.
vulnerability is
Rome debased
increasing.
its currency for 2
China,
centuries before
Russia,
the system
and
collapsed
other nations
catastrophically in
have
the
begun
3rd century
conducting
crisis.
bilateral
Every
trade
historical
in
example
currencies
followed a
other
similar
than
pattern
dollars,
of gradual decline
directly
followed by
challenging
sudden
the
collapse.
greenback's
The
monopoly
most
in
likely scenario,
international commerce.
based on historical precedent,
Central
is that
banks
the United
worldwide
States will
have
continue its
increased
current
gold
trajectory
purchases
until
to
forced to
record
change by
levels,
crisis.
suggesting
This
declining
crisis, when it
confidence
arrives,
in
will likely involve
dollar-denominated
some
reserves.
combination of currency collapse,
The BRICS
bond market
nations
revolt,
Brazil,
international
Russia,
abandonment of the
India,
dollar, and
China,
domestic
and
economic
South
chaos.
Africa have
The
discussed
political response to
creating
such crisis,
alternative
if history
payment
is any guide,
systems
will
and
involve some
potentially
combination
a
of
new reserve
scapegoating foreign
currency
enemies,
to
capital
reduce
controls,
dollar
comprehensive
dependence.
economic regulation,
While none
and
of
quite
these
possibly
developments
military escalation.
individually threatens
Leaders
dollar
facing domestic
hegemony,
collapse will face the
collectively
same
they
incentives that
represent
drove
the
Roman
early
empires,
stages
Spanish
of the
kings,
confidence
French
erosion
revolutionaries,
that
and German
precedes
dictators
currency
toward war.
collapse in
The
historical
specific
examples.
triggering events and exact
The
manifestations will
process
differ
may
from
take
historical
years
examples,
or
but the
decades,
underlying
but
dynamic,
the direction
desperate leaders
is
choosing military
unmistakable.
aggression over accepting the
American military
consequences of fiscal
policy
failure,
during this
will likely
period
remain
of
constant.
mounting fiscal stress
Alternative scenarios
follows
exist,
the
but require
historical
breaks from
pattern
historical
with
patterns.
disturbing precision.
International
The
cooperation
United
could create
States
a
has been
managed transition from
continuously
dollar
at
hegemony
war
to
for
a
over 2
multipolar currency
decades,
system,
with
avoiding the
military
catastrophic
operations
collapse
in
that typically
Afghanistan,
accompanies reserve
Iraq,
currency transitions.
Syria,
Domestic
Libya,
political
Yemen,
reform
and
could address
numerous
fiscal
other
imbalances before
locations.
crisis forces brutal
Defense
adjustments.
spending has remained
Technological
at levels
innovations might
historically
create genuinely new
economic
with major
possibilities
wars,
that
even
transcend
during
the resource
periods
constraints that
nominally
bound previous
characterized
empires.
as peacetime.
Each of these
The
alternatives is possible in
military-industrial
theory,
complex
but none
that
appears
President
likely given
Eisenhower
current trajectories and
warned
historical
has become
precedents.
fully
Hope
embedded
is
in
not
the
strategy,
American
and
economy.
hoping that this time
With
will be
weapons
different while
manufacturing
ignoring the
and
clear
defense
historical pattern
contracting
represents dangerous
major
wishful thinking.
industries in
Understanding
virtually
this
every
pattern
state.
does not mean accepting its
Proposals
inevitability.
to reduce
Humans possess
military
agency
spending
and can learn
face
from history
fierce
to avoid
opposition,
repeating its worst
not
mistakes.
only from
But
defense
learning from
hawks,
history
but from
requires
the
first
vast
acknowledging the
economic
patterns it reveals,
constituencies
even when
that
those patterns are
depend on
uncomfortable or
continued
challenge
military
existing assumptions.
expenditure.